So today we're going to go over how I color grade my footage to look like film using Dehancer Pro. I'm going to start off by creating 4 more nodes. The first node here is going to be a color space transform. The second node is for exposure adjustment, and the third node is for white balance. The fourth node here is where dehancers are going to live, and the fifth is another color space transform node. On the first node, we're going to drag a color space transform to that node. On the first node, we're going to transform the footage from Fujifilm F-Log2, which is going to be Rec 2020, input gamma, Fujifilm F-Log2, to DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. The reason I do this is because DaVinci Wide Gamut gives me a much larger color space to work in. It contains all the colors my camera can capture and more. And DaVinci Intermediate is a logarithmic gamma curve that preserves all my dynamic range while I'm working. This gives me the most flexibility before I apply any looks. On the fifth node, we're going to drag another color space transform. Input color space is going to be DaVinci Wide Gamut. Input gamma, DaVinci Intermediate. The output color space is going to be Rec 709. And output gamma, Rec 709A, since I'm on an Apple computer. Rec 709 is the standard color space for HD video. It's what your monitor and YouTube expect to receive. And the Rec 709A gamma curve is better slightly than standard Rec 709, and I find it gives me better results. Now let's go to the second node and make a couple small exposure adjustments to get our levels right. Look at the clip here. The footage looks a bit flat, so let's go into the lift, and we're going to bring the lift down a little bit to bring a little bit more contrast back into this footage. Now we can go over to the gain, bring a little bit more brightness into this clip, somewhere right about there. And let's go into the third node, and I like to do a little bit of a white balance increase, so we'll bring this usually up to about 100, I think. Yes, yeah, somewhere right about here I think looks good. Now let's go to the fourth node and add Dehancer. So we'll scroll down till we find Dehancer, drag on Dehancer Pro. Right when you drag it on, it's not going to look great, so let's go through every module over here and I'll tell you exactly how each one works and why I use it. Starting with the input module here at the top, this is where you tell Dehancer what kind of signal it's going to be receiving. This tells Dehancer what color space your footage is in, so since we transformed from F-Log2 to DaVinci Wide Gamut, we're going to go here and select DaVinci Wide Gamut / DaVinci Intermediate. And already you can tell that makes some changes, but it's still not getting the footage to where we want it to be. If you select choose camera, you can select a specific camera. You can get the vendor, the camera, and the format drop downs. This lets Dehancer apply camera specific adjustments, but I prefer handling my color space transforms separately for more control. So we're going to bring this back to DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate. The exposure comp. This is a global exposure adjustment that happens before any of the film emulation is applied. If your footage is too bright or too dark going into Dehancer, you can correct it here, but I usually do my exposure work on a separate node, but this is useful for a little bit of fine tuning if you need to do that. So you can see if we drag the exposure comp down, it's going to make the footage darker. Drag it up, it's going to make the footage lighter. And same with the temperature, warmer and cooler. Same with the tint, greener and more magenta. With the defringe slider here, I don't really touch it that much, but this reduces the chromatic aberration, which is that purple or green fringing that you sometimes see on like high contrast edges, especially when shooting wide open. The defringe slider controls how aggressively it removes the fringing, and the defringe radius slider controls how wide an area around the edges it affects. If you're shooting with vintage lenses or fast apertures, this can really clean up the edges of your image. The film module here is literally like the heart of Dehancer. This is where you select your negative film stock emulation. Over here you can see profile. So this is the profile dropdown. This is where you choose which film stock you want to emulate. Each film stock has its own unique color science, contrast curve, and character. Kodak stocks tend to be warmer with more natural skin tones, and Fuji stocks are often cooler and more vibrant. The cinema stocks, like Kodak Vision 3, have specific looks designed for motion picture work, so we're going to keep this on Kodak Vision 3 250D, which is personally one of my favorites. But if you select one like 500T, you can see that the picture will change, but we're going to go ahead and keep 250D for this example. The push and pull slider here. This simulates what happens when you push or pull film in development. In the real world, pushing film means developing it in longer to compensate for underexposure. This increases contrast and grain. Pulling is the opposite, shorter development time, which reduces contrast and grain. Positive values push, negative values pull. This is a creative tool, so pushing can give you a grittier, more contrasty look versus pulling it, which can get you a softer, more flatter look. But for this, I usually leave it around 0. Also, make sure the enable checkbox is ticked or none of this will apply to your image, as you can see here. Now we move on to the Film Developer module. Film Developer gives you more control over the chemical development process simulation. So for the contrast boost, this adds contrast to your image in a way that mimics how contrast is affected during film development. It's different from just adding contrast in your color wheels. It has a more organic filmic quality to how it affects the tonal range. But make sure before clicking any of this, you have this checkbox enabled. So if we go ahead and pull the slider to the left, we can see the image gets way less contrasty versus if we pull it to the right, a lot more contrast gets baked into that. With the gamma correction slider, this adjusts the midtone brightness without affecting your blacks or whites as much. It's useful for lifting or lowering the overall brightness of your image while maintaining your contrast. Think of it like adjusting the middle of your tone curve. The color separation slider here, this affects how distinct and separated the color channels are from each other. Higher values give you more vivid separated color, while lower values blend the colors more, which can give you a more muted pastel look. Real film has a certain way it separates colors, and this lets you dial that in. The color boost slider here is essentially a saturation control, but it's tied into the film development simulation. It affects how saturated your colors appear in the development process. Higher values give you richer colors, while lower values give you a more desaturated look. Personally, I like to keep this bumped up anywhere around 80 to 90. I feel like it brings a lot more life back into the image. All right, now onto the film compression module. Make sure again this is enabled, and with the film compression, this simulates how real film handles extreme brightness values. Film naturally compresses highlights. It doesn't clip harshly like digital does, so this module lets you control that behavior. With the impact slider, this controls how much of the compression effect is applied overall. Higher values give you more of that soft filmic highlight roll-off, and lower values keep things closer to your digital footage. So I'm going to drag this probably somewhere around 55. The white point, this sets where your highlights start to compress. It's essentially the ceiling of your image. Adjusting this affects how bright your brightest areas can get before they start rolling off. So I'm going to leave this somewhere around right there. Looks good. The tonal range, this affects how wide of a tonal range is affected by the compression. The higher values compress a wider range of tones, and the lower values will only affect the extreme highlights. So I'm going to push this somewhere right around, that looks good. And the color density, this controls how saturated the colors are in the compressed areas. Film often has a rich, dense colors, even in the highlights, so the higher values give you more color density. The lower values let the highlights wash out a bit more. I'm going to push this pretty high because I like the colors being really dense. Now we'll move on to the expand module. Expand controls your dynamic range, basically where your blacks and whites end up. Again, make sure it's enabled. And the black point, this sets where your darkest tones sit. At 0, your blacks go all the way to true black. If you raise this, your blacks get lifted, giving you that faded vintage film look that's really popular right now. Old film prints often had lifted blacks because of the black dyes would fade over time. So I'm gonna leave this somewhere around 9.3. The white point, this sets your highlight ceiling. At 100, your whites go all the way to pure white. Lowering this compresses your highlights and can prevent clipping, but also reduces the overall brightness of your image. As you can see, if we bring this up to 120, it gets less bright versus if we bring it down this way, the image gets really, really bright. So I'm gonna leave this somewhere around 95. The color mode drop down. This changes how the expansion affects color. Normal is the standard behavior, while the other modes give you different looks. Experiment with them, see what works for your footage and what works for you. But I'm going to leave this on normal. Now let's move on to the print module. Again, make sure it's enabled. The print module here is huge because in the real film world, you shoot on negative film and then that negative gets printed onto print film for projection. The print film stock has its own color science and characteristics, so this module emulates that second step. With the profile dropdown, this lets you choose different print film stocks. Linear means no print emulation. This is just the raw negative look. And the other options here are different print film stocks, each with their own character. Kodak 2383 print film is the industry standard for motion picture print stock used in Hollywood for decades, and this is personally the one I like to go with, so we're going to select this one. The target white slider, this controls the brightness of the white point through the print emulation. It affects how your highlights render on the simulated print stock. You can see if you bring it up to around 2, you're going to get some cooler highlights. Versus if you bring this down to -2, you're gonna get some warmer highlights. I usually like to bring this down a bit because I like a warmer highlight. So I'm gonna put this around here. The exposure slider here, this is an exposure adjustment that happens through the print emulation. Think of it like adjusting the printer lights in a real film lab. It changes how bright the print comes out. So if we bring this up, it's gonna brighten the whole print. And if we bring this down, it's going to darken the whole print. So I usually leave this at 0 since I've already made my exposure adjustments previously. The tonal contrast slider, this adds or removes contrast in the print stage. It's different from the contrast in Film Developer. This is specifically how the print stock renders contrast. So again, I've already dialed in contrast and exposure, so I'm going to usually keep this around 0. The color density, this affects how rich and saturated the colors appear on the print. The higher values give you a deeper, denser, more saturated color, versus the lower values give you a more washed out print look. I usually like to have a really deep color density, so I'm going to push this somewhere around here because it gives you a really nice tan skin tone. The saturation slider, this is the overall color saturation for the print. It's pretty straightforward. Higher is obviously more saturated, while lower is desaturated. The analog range limiter, when enabled, this prevents colors from going out of gamut. Real film has physical limits to how saturated colors can get, so this checkbox enforces those limits and can help prevent ugly clipping in the saturated areas. Now let's move on to the color head module. The color head simulates the color timing controls on a film printer. In a real lab, the colorist would adjust colored lights to shift the overall color of the print. This is the classic way films were color graded before digital. And the yellow-blue slider, this shifts your image on the yellow-blue axis. Positive values will add more blue and cool tones, while negative values will add more warm and yellow tones to the image. This affects the entire image globally, as you guys can see as well. The magenta and green slider, same thing, shifts your image on the magenta green axis. Positive values will add some green, and the negative values will add some magenta. Same with the cyan and the red. This will add red into the image, while negative values will add blue into the image. You can see where you can get a lot of creative control just by using these sliders here and really fine-tuning in kind of the overall look you want for the image. So if you see a little before after. Not too much, but definitely have added some more warmth into the image. With the gang checkbox enabled, this links all 3 of these color channels together so they move as one. Versus being able to drag all these separately, we can go and we can click the gang. And this is useful for making neutral adjustments without introducing a lot of weird color casts. So if we go ahead and drag these, it's not as crazy as it would be having all of these separated out. The shadows tone slider here, this lets you add color shifts specifically to your shadow areas. This is where you'd add that classic teal in the shadows or orange in the shadows look. So if we drag it to the right, you can see some orange, versus if we drag it to the left, we get that teal into the shadows. The midtones, same thing, but for your midtones, this affects the bulk of your image, the skin tones, and most of the overall scene, as you can see here. And the highlights tone, this color shifts for your highlights, great for adding warmth to the bright areas or cooling down some hot spots. So you can see it really brings the warmth down in the image since there's a lot of white. Or if we boost it up, definitely adds a lot more warmth to the highlights here. I'm gonna sometimes bring this up a bit warmer because I like a bit more warmth in the highlights as well. So I think for this image, we're gonna leave it around 30. The persevere exposure, this keeps your overall brightness consistent as you make color shifts. Without this, adding yellow might also brighten your image. With it enabled, the brightness stays consistent. And the impact, this is the master strength for all the color head adjustments. At 100%, you get the full effect of your settings. Lower it to reduce intensity of all your color head work, and you can see it's not as bright when we did this highlight adjustment. And it adds a very small effect that you can dial in. Now let's move on to the film grain module. The film grain adds organic texture to the footage. Digital footage is too clean, and it lacks the random variation that makes film feel alive. So grain is one of the most important elements for selling the film look. In the profile dropdown, this lets you choose different grain profiles. They're based on real film stocks in different ISO settings. 35mm ISO 250 gives you fine grain, while higher ISO options give you more visible, grittier grain. 16mm options give you even more pronounced grain because the smaller film format means there's way more visible grain in the structure. The amount controls how visible the grain is. The higher values give you more prominent grain, and the lower values make it more subtle. I usually keep this subtle enough that you feel it more than you see it. You want more texture and not distraction. If it's too high, it starts to look really bad. So I usually keep it somewhere around 30 to 20. Now let's move on to the halation module. Halation is one of my favorite film characteristics. It's that red or orange glow you see bleeding out from the film, from the bright light sources in the film footage. This happens because light passes through the emulsion, it bounces off the film base and exposes the emulsion again from behind. The red sensitive layer is the closest to that base, so you get that characteristic red glow. So for the profile dropdown, different film formats have different halation characteristics. 35 and Super 35 are the two most common, while the larger formats have less visible halation, and the 8mm Super 8 have way more visible halation, as you can see here. So for my footage, I usually like to keep this around 65 to 35, and for this, probably keep it around 35/Super 35. With the amplify slider, this controls how intense the halation effect is. The higher values will give you more obvious red glow around your highlights. I usually keep this pretty subtle. I want it to feel natural and not like a filter. So I usually look around the image and just adjust this based on what I see in the edges of the film. The mask mode, when enabled, this shows you a black and white mask of where the halation is being applied. It's useful for dialing in your settings and then turn it off for the final look. Now let's move on to the bloom module. Bloom is similar to halation, but different. While halation is that red glow from light bouncing in from the film, Bloom is more of a general softening and glow around the bright areas. It's caused by light scattering in the lens and the film emulsion. It gives your highlights a dreamy but like soft quality to them. So let's go ahead and enable that. And you can see there's already a glow that starts to happen around all the edges. So the amplify slider, this controls the intensity of the bloom effect. The higher values can give you more glow. This is great for romantic or dreamy looks, but can also just soften harsh digital highlights. But I don't like it too strong. As you can see, if it's all the way at 100, it's a pretty strong effect. So I'm gonna bring this somewhere down to like 32. Mask mode, same installation, shows you where the effect is being applied. Now let's move on to the film damage module. Film damage adds scratches, dust, and other artifacts that you'd probably see on old or poorly handled film. This is a stylistic choice. You probably don't want this for most projects, but it can look great for flashback sequences or vintage looks. For most of my editing, I don't use this, but it is a good effect when you're trying to emulate like really old footage, or like Super 8 footage is a really great time to use this. But I'm just going to leave this off because as you can see, like you can start seeing all those different film effects on the footage and it looks like it's really damaged and really old. But for my footage, I like it to look clean and not damaged, so I'm just going to leave this disabled. The film breath module, this simulates the subtle frame-to-frame variations that happen with real film. Nothing is perfectly consistent with film. There are tiny fluctuations in exposure, color, and density from frame to frame. So this randomness is part of what makes film feel organic and alive. It's a very minor effect, so when it's enabled, you're not really going to see anything happen, but when the film is playing, you're going to see slight flickers in exposure and color, but very slightly. I usually leave this disabled for most projects. Now we'll move on to the gate weave module. Gate weave simulates the slight movement of film as it passes through the camera or projector gate. Film doesn't sit perfectly still, so there's always a tiny bit of wobble in movement. This micro instability is another thing that makes film feel different from locked off digital footage. Again, profile, drop down, different formats have different weave characteristics. Again, 8mm, 16, 35, and 65mm. I usually, again, leave this off for most projects. Now we can go on to the overscan module. The overscan adds the film gate frame and sprocket holes around your image. This is a very specific stylistic choice. It makes your footage look like you're viewing from an actual film strip. It's great for music videos or other stylized content, probably not for narrative work where you want the audience immersed in the story. So if we click enable, you can see there's a film border that goes around this. If we select Super 8, you can see there's a Super 8, which when I'm trying to emulate Super 8 footage, I usually use this a lot. It's great for that. Super 16, you can have that overscan effect as well. And so these effects are great when you're trying to emulate like 16mm or 8mm, or you want like some kind of border showing for archival footage or something. But for most projects, I'm just going to leave this disabled. Now we'll move on to the vignette. The vignette darkens the edges of your frame, naturally drawing the viewer's eye towards the center. This happens naturally with many lenses, especially vintage ones and wider apertures. It's a subtle way to focus the attention and depth of the viewer. So if we click enable, you can see the image gets a bit darker around the edges here. We can change the exposure, which will really darken it, or we can add a reverse vignette as well, which is becoming very popular in a lot of photography images. If we change the size, we can see it gets really close to the center versus if we move it out this way, it gets a bit closer to just the edges. The feather obviously does what feather does. It'll feather the edges of the vignette. So you can see again, if we adjust the size, move it around me, then adjust the feather, and it really pulls your focus right into the center of the frame. The aspect ratio, this stretches the vignette horizontally or vertically. So just to show you what this looks like, right now it was a perfect circle, and we can stretch it horizontally or we can stretch it vertically depending on how we want the effect to be. And that's every single module and slider. Let me show you the before and after so you can see the full transformation. So that's before, and that's after using Dehancer Pro. The key is that all these elements work together. The film stock emulation, the grain, the halation, and the subtle imperfections, they all combine to create something that feels organic and alive in a way that clean footage usually doesn't. So now you understand what every control does. Now you can experiment and create your own looks. Every project is different and every shot is different, so use these tools to serve your story. If this video was helpful, then go ahead, hit that like button and subscribe for more color grading tutorials. Drop a comment below if you want me to break down any specific film stock looks or cover any other topics, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.